All right, hello everybody. This is Mario, just recording the lab for the central nervous system. Hope your guys' break is going all right, and I hope that this little video helps you kind of review the nervous system and the way that I want you to know it for the quiz and the exam. So this video is going to be in part for my 210 classes as well as my 201, so let's go ahead and just get started. This first slide shows this lady right here. This is Dr. Taylor. She actually wrote this book called My Stroke of Insight. She's somebody who actually did a lot of research on strokes, and then she actually had one herself. So this just kind of shows like a subjective as well as objective view of everything. It's a pretty interesting book overall. So go ahead and skip through a few different slides. Perfect. So let's take a look at, well, let's go ahead and flip that real quick. So let's go ahead and take a look at the overall nervous system group and its general mapping. So our nervous system in general can be split into two different types of nervous systems. First off, we have the central nervous system, and then we have the peripheral nervous system as well. So for the central nervous system, it's pretty straightforward. All it's composing of is our brain, the brain stem, as well as the spinal cord that's running through your vertebral foramen. On the other hand, the peripheral nervous system is where things get a little bit more interesting. Pretty much all of our spinal nerve roots that are branching off, all of our cranial nerves that are branching off of the spinal cord and brain itself, will be making up the peripheral nervous system. And those guys are going to be basically communicating everything that they understand, all the input that they have, all the output that they do through the brain and brain stem and the spinal cord. So there's a lot to cover with the nervous system, and this class is pretty much just going to get to the tip of the iceberg. But I want to introduce you guys to the nervous system as best as I know how, and at least spark a little bit of interest into how the body works. So the peripheral nervous system is also split into two different types here. We have motor and we have sensory. Now, for our motor and sensory nerves, they actually have an alternative name as well that we're going to have to know. We're going to have to know the terms afferent and efferent nerve fibers. So afferent is referring to sensory. It's just another name for sensory. That's the only thing that's getting changed there. Efferent is just referring to the motor fibers. So the way that I like to think about afferent and efferent to make sure that I got them right in my head, the letter A comes before the letter E. So I always kind of interpret that as like, oh, you need to feel something before you can act on it. That's a way that I remembered it. There's also another mnemonic that says, the afferent nerves ascend the spinal cord, and that's how it goes up to the brain to get interpreted through sensory information. On the other hand, the efferent nerve exits the spinal cord, and that's how it sends its motor contributions to the rest of the body. Now, as you can see, these guys are going to split up once again. Our afferent sensory nerve fibers are actually split into visceral and somatic. So if we break up that Latin word for soma, soma is referring to the nerve, soma refers to body. So somatic is essentially just referring to the body in general. This is everything that controls our muscles, our epithelial connective tissue, and our skeletal muscle, everything that we're kind of conscious of. Visceral, on the other hand, is kind of like viscera, which is referring to the organs. So if you feel something of your stomach, of your heart, anything internal, that would be from your visceral afferent nerve fibers. Somatic is everything else. If you place your hand on your wrist or something, that would be like a somatic afferent nerve fiber. Now looking over here, we have efferent motor fibers. So with regards to efferent motor fibers, we actually have a few more splittings going on. So first off, we have somatic. So somatic is kind of your conscious control. This is something that you can actively do. Your nerve fibers are going to your arms, you're flexing your arms, you're extending them, you're moving your wrists around in a rotation. That's all somatic efferent motor fibers. On the other hand, the visceral motor fibers are actually going to be deemed the part of the autonomic nervous system. So when you think of autonomic, you're automatically hopefully thinking of the term like automatic. That's at least what I think of when I think of autonomic. So this means that you are not in conscious control of it. This is something that's already just kind of occurring. So the autonomic nervous system is going to be split into what is known as the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system are in control of various parts of your bodies. They control your heart rate, how much airflow is getting into your lungs, the movement of your bowels, your urinary bladder, all kinds of stuff. The biggest separation between these two guys is to understand that the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are antagonists to each other, which means that they do the complete opposite, right? Because you don't just want a nervous system that increases your heart rate, eventually you want it to slow back down too, right? So our sympathetic nervous system is deemed the fight or flight response. So basically, if you were walking down the street and let's say a tiger jumps out of the I'm not exactly sure why a tiger would be in the suburbs or, in central Phoenix, but you know what? We got a tiger. So this tiger is basically activating your sympathetic nervous system. So you want to think about what do you want to happen if you're gonna fight or run away from this tiger. You want increased blood flowing to your muscles, to your limbs, your upper extremity, your lower extremity. You want an increased heart rate. You want your pupils to dilate so that they can see more. You want your bronchioles inside of your lungs to increase so you have more airflow. Overall, just getting ready for like a fight in that situation. Your parasympathetic nervous system is going to be the opposite. This is your rest and digest. That's kind of how you can remember it. Rest and digest. So for your rest and digest, basically you want more blood flow to your digestive organs, something to slow it down. It's also going to do the complete opposite to your heart. So it's going to slow down your heart. It's going to decrease airflow into your lungs. Basically, kind of relax you overall. What's kind of interesting is that when you start thinking about, pharmaceuticals are actually what kind of mimic, the sympathetic and parasympathetic responses in order to kind of fix any ailments you have. So, you guys may have heard of beta blockers before. Beta blockers are basically agonists, which means like they support the parasympathetic nervous system. They slow down your heart rate actively because, you don't want your heart rate going crazy all the time in cases of like anxiety and stuff like that. So that was kind of a mouthful. Let's kind of keep on going. Um, Here's just showing you again general organization of the system. We'll go ahead and draw. So we got brain, part of the central nervous system, spinal cord, that's still central nervous, and then the nerves that are kind of branching off of that are going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. The enteric nervous system, just to make a brief mention of it, I won't be asking any questions or talking to you guys too much in detail about it, but the enteric nervous system is essentially part of your autonomous functioning of your gut. Basically, your entire digestive tract has like its own dedicated nervous system that what I find really interesting is that it operates independently of the brain and spinal cord. So it kind of gives like a whole new meaning to like the idea that, you have a gut feeling because it's operating independent of your brain. It's pretty cool. Here, we're just taking a look at some of the basic components of a neuron. So, in general, when we are getting essentially, I'm going to switch to laser pointer because my pen is just not working right now. Um, Basically, when we are getting a nerve impulse, our dendrites are going to be part of the neuron that are going to intake that signal. That signal is then going to be taken to the cell body, which is also known as the soma, and that's where it's going to be interpreted. Then we're going to go about this angle, which is known as the axon hillock. So that's kind of where our action potential is going to take place. Hopefully, you guys have talked a little bit about this in lecture. And it's going to basically send that nerve impulse, that action potential, down the axon before eventually attaching onto the dendrites of the next neuron for that signal to be interpreted. And these neurons are basically all linked up, going all the way back eventually to your brain. Now, neuroglia. So, neuroglia are just referring to the supporting nervous system cells. Pretty much everything that we're kind of talking about was of the general neuron. These cells themselves are the actual cells that are going to be supporting it. So for the central nervous system, we have four different types of cells. For the peripheral nervous system, we only have two. So let's go ahead and focus on the bigger chunk real quick. So for ependymal cells are basically small cells circulating around your ventricles that are going to create cerebral spinal fluid. This is also known as CSF for little shorthand. Um, Cerebrospinal fluid is essentially the fluid that floats around your brain and spinal cord. This is a little bit different from your blood supply. There's a few different components in terms of like the ion concentration, but overall, your cerebrospinal fluid is what allows for glucose to get to the brain, all that sugar. It allows for buoyancy, allows for your brain to kind of float around. Make sure it doesn't collapse under its own weight and like crush its own blood supply. Um, so overall, it's very important. It's producing that cerebrospinal fluid. Now, astrocytes are what create the BBB, so the blood-brain barrier. Now, hopefully, you guys have probably heard of the blood-brain barrier before. It's a super important part of basically keeping the brain separated from the rest of the body in cases of infection or pathogens kind of entering. Um, Basically, your astrocytes are making sure that whatever is occurring at the brain will be preserved. So you want to make sure that the brain is preserved and it's not being affected with like any kind of common flu or anything like that. Next up, we have oligodendrocytes. I don't know why I always have trouble mispronouncing that word. My tongue just kind of rolls up on itself. Oligodendrocytes are what are going to myelinate the central nervous system and provide a central network. So, when we're thinking of myelination, myelination is the insulation around our axons. So basically, it's going to be the insulation around this axon right here, kind of maintaining that action potential, making sure that there's not a loss of charge that's like kind of getting expelled elsewhere. So these guys are going to myelinate the central nervous system axons, and it's going to make sure that, excuse me, it's going to make sure that it's like the speed is going to be kept up. The speed is going to be going faster. Next up, we have microglia. So microglia are basically these cells that are going to be kind of patrolling. They're like macrophages, part of the immune system. They're going to be patrolling around the central nervous system, basically getting rid of pathogens. Now, next up, looking at the peripheral nervous system, these Schwann cells are basically going to exactly mimic the oligodendrocytes. So as long as you know the production or like the process and function of oligodendrocytes, you will know exactly what Schwann cells are doing. Satellite cells, on the other hand, are basically going to be making up the rest of these guys. So ependymal or astrocytes and microglia are basically combined into just what are satellite cells. Ependymal cells are kind of something that's unique to the central nervous system, though. All right, so taking a look at the spinal cord from the back. Now, we've talked about the vertebrae before. We talked about, the seven cervical vertebrae, the 12 thoracic, five lumbar. We're basically going to talk about spinal segments in the same exact scenario. So for our spinal segments, C1 is coming out from the C1 intervertebral foramen. That's basically coming out at that level. So it makes it really easy overall. So we have five lumbar vertebrae, therefore we're going to have five lumbar spinal roots kind of coming out. We have 12 thoracic vertebrae, now we're going to have 12 thoracic spinal roots. Now for cervical, it's the only one that's a little different. Instead of having seven cervical spinal roots, kind of like the same number of vertebrae, we're actually going to have eight cervical spinal roots that are coming out. So that just kind of changes things just a little bit. So taking a look at the spinal cord again, we have white matter and gray matter. Gray matter is referring to the unmyelinated portions of the nervous system. White matter is myelinated. So white matter is going to be myelinated. Now pretty much looking at these cross sections of the spinal cord, all the parts that look white are going to be the white matter. All the parts that are in the center and are gray are going to be the gray matter. It's pretty straightforward. Um, the gray matter is composed of basically the dendrites as well as the soma or the neuronal bodies. That's why it kind of appears as gray because these are all the neuronal bodies that are taking place in here. White matter, on the other hand, is where all the axons are going to be traveling over. We'll talk about the dorsal root ganglion in just a bit. Conus medullaris. So the conus medullaris is cut off about right here. The conus medullaris is named because it looks like a cone. And it's actually going to be broken off right about at this level because basically during embryo, when we are first developing, our spinal cord is fully developed. When we are basically coming out the womb, but our vertebrae the actual bones are not completely done. So they're going to continue to grow, and eventually it's going to stretch until the adult vertebral column is much longer than the spinal cord was in the first place. So this kind of marks the end of where our spinal cord is at. It's the conus medullaris. However, obviously, we still have a bunch of nerves going down to our lower extremities and everything else around our abdomen. So what's happening is we have what is known as cauda equina. So we break up this word. Cauda refers to tail. Equina refers to horse. So this pretty much looks like a horse's tail. Cauda equina is referring to all these spinal nerve roots that are branching off past the conus medullaris and continue to stretch down and going through each intervertebral foramen. Then finally, we have the filum terminale. Filum terminale is just referring to the final ligamentous attachment. It's attaching all the way down here on the coccygeal ligament. That's what it eventually turns into. It's basically just there for suspensory support of the spinal cord. All right, let's get into some cross sections here of the spinal cord. So I'm going to go ahead and make a few different little drawings right about here, just to kind of branch it off. So what these guys are known as horns. So we have a ventral horn, we have a dorsal horn, and we have a lateral horn. So what these horns are kind of representing is the different parts of the nervous system that we've already kind of talked about with regards to sensory and motor output. So for our ventral horn right here, our ventral horn is what's going to contain the somatic motor neurons. So all of that conscious effort that we do to flex our muscles, to extend our muscles, to move our body around consciously, those cell bodies are going to be found in the ventral horn. The lateral horn is going to be found up with the cell bodies of the sympathetic neurons. So that's going to be all of the autonomic nervous system, kind of controlling how our body works on the inside. Our heart rate, our breathing, stuff like that. Now, moving on to the backside. Now, this is the only thing that kind of goes against the trend. The sensory neuronal bodies are not going to be found in the dorsal horn. Instead, they're going to be found in what is known as the dorsal root ganglion. So the dorsal root ganglion is just this cell body that's kind of sticking outside of the spinal cord, and this is where the cell body is going to be interpreting that information for whatever sensory input comes in and then enters the spinal cord at this level. Also, I should just point out the central canal. This is something we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about ventricles. The central canal is this small little hole in the center of the spinal cord, and this is where it's going to allow for the cerebral spinal fluid to travel through and circulate around the central nervous system. Um, let's see. Pretty much, there's just a few different sections. There's posterior medial sulcus. There's just a few different anatomical identifications that you can look at here, but we'll kind of keep on moving in the meantime. All right, so unfortunately, I really wanted to show you guys this in class, but like I said, we're over winter break instead, or sorry, Thanksgiving break. So basically, we have a lot of different nerves to be found in the body, and I'll try and break them up as much as possible. If I feel like it's not a good enough job, I'll make a separate video just for those guys. So for our brachial plexus, we have 5 different branches that are coming off of the brachial plexus. Now, first off, you might be wondering what exactly is a plexus. A plexus is just a conjunction of peripheral nerves that are all kind of working together. Um, they're all kind of working together to create a large mass to cover a lot of surface area of various limbs. So we have a cervical plexus, brachial plexus, lumbosacral plexus. For our brachial plexus is making up the nerves that control the upper extremity. So if you guys take a look at the VK PowerPoint that I posted in announcements for identification of the peripheral nervous or of the brachial plexus nerves on the arm, that should be a really good resource. But it's obviously going to look a little bit different in the cadaver. So um, in general, our musculocutaneous nerve, this nerve is going to basically innervate the entire anterior compartment of our brachial region. So it's going to innervate our brachialis, our biceps brachii, our coracobrachialis. This nerve is easiest to be found because this nerve is going to insert directly into our coracobrachialis muscle. Radial nerve. This radial nerve innervates all of our extensor muscles, so we're pretty much always going to find this guy on the posterior aspect of the arm and as well as the forearm. Easiest way to find him on the cadaver is he's going to be located underneath the brachioradialis. That's a little dissection tip for you guys. The median and ulnar nerve are basically going to be controlling the forearm muscles. The ulnar nerve is going to be innervating the basically ulnar half of the forearm. So if you want like a good dermatome to kind of mark exactly where it ends, if you look at your ring finger, you cut that in half. Everything on the medial side is innervated by the ulnar nerve. The median nerve is pretty much going to innervate everything on the lateral one half of the ring finger. So your middle finger, index finger, your thumb, all that's going to be kind of median nerve, kind of running down. And then finally, your axillary nerve. Your axillary nerve is actually going to be a very posterior nerve that kind of comes out through our quadrangular space. And it's going to innervate some of the posterior aspects, but it's a little bit harder to find in the cadaver, so I'm unlikely to kind of pin that for you guys. Taking a look at the other nerves you have to know for the lower extremity, we have the femoral nerve. I've shown you guys this in class numerous times already. The femoral nerve is part of the navel, part of the femoral triangle contents. So I have a lot of faith that you guys will be able to find that just fine. The sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve is something that I also pointed out explicitly in class. It's the huge bundle of nerve that's protruding out from underneath the piriformis muscle, right in the gluteal region. The only thing we didn't really cover too much is that the sciatic nerve is going to travel down the length of the posterior thigh, and then it's going to get about to the popliteal region before the sciatic nerve is going to split into a tibial and common fibular nerve. This is also known as the common peroneal nerve. So the tibial nerve is going to be on the more medial side. That's controlling, or not, sorry, not controlling, but basically it's going to be on the more medial side, on the tibial side. So if you remember where your tibia and your fibula are, that should be a pretty easy way to remember which nerves are going on to which side. Now, taking a look at the brain, how it's protected and encased, it is protected by what are known as the meninges. So you guys may have heard of the meninges before. The meninges are most commonly referenced in meningitis. So itis means inflammation, and then meninges is referring to the meninges. So meningitis would be like inflammation of the meninges or inflammation of the brain overall. That's just an easy way to kind of remember things there. So, first thing I want to talk about is the matters. So, dura mater, arachnoid matter, and pia mater. Um, and then we'll talk about the spaces afterwards. So, dura mater. If we break up this word, dura means tough and strong. You can think of this in terms of durable. That is literally like the same exact context that durable is coming from the original Greek. Dura is referring to durable. Mater means it means mother from the Greek translation. So I'm not exactly too sure how much that'll help you, but dura mater is referring to the tough mother that's kind of protecting your brain. So if you have a really tough mother, she is protecting your brain. Arachnoid matter. So, arachnoid is referring to spider. You already know this from arachnophobia. That's just the fear of spiders. So, arachnoid is referring to being spider-like because when we take a look at the brain, like on a gross anatomical perspective, it looks like a spider web that's kind of stretching out throughout the brain. Pia means like soft and middle. So if we have a strong matter, we have a strong mother, we now have a soft mother. The Pia matter is pretty much the actual contact of the brain itself. Now these spaces are basically referring to these spaces between the meninges. So the epidural space, epi meaning above, so it's going to be above the dural space. Subdural is referring to beneath the dura mater. Subarachnoid space would just be the space between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater. The only thing that I really want you to kind of pay attention to here is that the subarachnoid space is where our cerebral spinal fluid is going to be flowing. So these meninges are actually going to spread throughout the entire spinal cord as well. So our spinal cord is also going to have dura mater, arachnoid matter, pia mater, all that kind of fun stuff. And that a subarachnoid space around the brain as well as around the spinal cord is where the cerebral spinal fluid is going to be flowing in. Um, Right here we have an epidural hematoma. It's just showing hema is referring to blood, toma refers to tissue. So this is blood in the tissue in the epidural space. This just kind of shows like one of those pathologies of something that's really dangerous. Basically, how blood can like kind of put a lot of pressure on the brain, and this is a very emergency kind of case. Um, we also have stroke, just kind of shows like a necrotic tissue of some of the brain that died. Stroke is because of a blocking of the blood flow that's kind of stretching over to parts of the brain. So it's also pretty crazy. We'll kind of skip all this. This is unnecessary. This is just showing like the different like layers of the brain. Here's the dura mater that I was kind of referring to. Arachnoid matter, you can see the spider webbing kind of going on, and subarachnoid space is just underneath the arachnoid mater. We'll kind of skip development of the brain as well because we'll talk about it in a different context. All right, so moving on to the actual brain. Um, let's see. There is quite a little bit to talk about here, so I'll probably post this in a separate video, and I'll end it right here. So I hope you guys enjoyed this first half of like the spinal cord and introduction to the nervous system. I do not want to keep my ink annotations.